Welcome back to the Mind of Brandon. Today we're going to continue our Bible study. As indicated by the title of this video, wherever YouTube's putting that these days, I'm going to be talking about the cosmology of the book of Genesis. To recap though, in my first video I talked in detail about Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, which postulated that in the beginning the god Elohim created the heaven and the earth. I also talked about how this word Elohim is technically the plural form of the word El, which is a generic Shemitic term for any god, but prior to that was the personal name of a particular god. The reason that the plural form of El is being translated as God singular in Genesis chapter 1 is because translators aren't taking its plurality literally. They're instead interpreting it as a royal plural, which is believed to denote largeness or superiority. In my second video, I talked in detail about Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, which established what conditions were like at the time when God created the heaven and the earth. And so we saw a perpetuation of this concept of the Primeval Sea, this idea common to ancient Near Eastern mythology that prior to the creation of heaven and earth, there is a sea of primordial waters, the Sea of Chaos. In my third video, I talked about Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, also touching on verses 4 and 5. And we saw the creation of the light of day. I pointed out that while it's tempting to just kind of figure this light of day as light from the sun evidently is not going to be created until a later day, so this must be some other light. And probably light from the planet Venus, which in antiquity was also referred to as Lucifer, a Latin term that means bringer of light. Moving on then to the second day, God places in the midst of the primordial waters something which in Hebrew is called rakia, but in English it's referred to as a space, an expanse, a vault, a firmament, or a dome. And this space, expanse, vault, firmament, dome thing is used to separate the waters so that there are waters above and waters below. God then names this space, expanse, vault, firmament, dome thing, and what he calls it is Shemayim, interpreted to mean heaven or sky. So it is here on the second day that we see the creation of the dome of heaven. On the third day, God takes the waters which are under the dome and gathers them together into one place. This allows dry land to appear. God then names the dry land Aretz, interpreted to mean earth, and bestows upon the earth the ability to produce vegetation. Notice that God is not himself the one creating the vegetation. He gives the earth the ability to produce it. So by creating the earth, God has created something that is going to aid in the creative process. Now, what about these waters that have been gathered together into one place? The name that God gives those is Yamim, which is generally interpreted to mean seas, but I'd like to personally point out that waters gathered together into one place, that sounds to me more like a single sea. If we're talking about the various seas of the earth, those exist in different places, not one place. So I do challenge this translation. Don't get me wrong. This Hebrew term yamim is the plural form of yam, the Hebrew word for sea. But that should raise the question, is it a literal plural or another royal plural, right? Because remember, Elohim is being interpreted here as a royal plural. This is because it takes singular verbs, so the context supports it being interpreted as a royal plural. Likewise, the context supports the royal plural interpretation of yamim. So all these different Bibles that have this literal interpretation and translated as seas, well, they're wrong. Okay, it's really talking about a single sea, right? Just wanted to make sure we have that understanding. Okay, it's really just talking about a single sea. Not too hard to figure out which particular sea it's probably talking about, seeing as how the land of the Hebrews was located on the southern coast of a rather large and majestic sea known as the Mediterranean. It's possible this is the only sea the author knew about. More likely, however, it's just the only sea the author found particularly worth mentioning, right? We have to consider his context, where does he live, and who is he writing for? That being said, I also want to point out a parallel to something seen in the traditions of the Canaanites. In Canaanite tradition, the god El, when he creates the sea god, he names him Yam. So, likewise, here in Genesis chapter 1, just as the Canaanite god El names the sea god Yam, here in Genesis chapter 1, Elohim names Yamim. Right? Thought that was interesting. Moving on to the fourth day, God says, let there be lights. Plural. Right? On the first day he says, let there be light. On the fourth day it's let there be lights. Right? Let there be lights in the dome of heaven. It specifies that there's two great lights, one that rules the day and another that rules the night, and there are the stars. Now, there's little doubt in anyone's mind here that the two great lights are a reference to the sun and the moon. It doesn't call them that, though, and that's very curious. Not sure why that is. I could only speculate. But, prior to this, God's naming things. He names the pre-existing darkness. He calls it Lila, interpreted to mean night. He names the first light that he creates. He calls it Yom, interpreted to mean day. He names heaven and earth. He calls them Shamayim and Daretz. And of course he names the Mediterranean Sea, calling it Yamim. After that, though, the naming stops. Doesn't name the sun and the moon. Right? Again, I could only speculate. I will point out that it says that these lights are there for signs and seasons and days and years. So they seem to be serving a sort of technological function. They're tools of some sort. Which kind of begs the question, is that not how we're perceiving these other things that God is naming? We'll come back to this point. For now, let's just go ahead and establish, where is it that God's placing these lights? In the dome of heaven, right? The dome of heaven, which separates the waters above from the waters below. Keeping in mind the waters below are the ones gathered together into one place to form the Mediterranean Sea. So what about the waters above? What are those? Okay, now, I've heard some people speculate that the waters above is a reference to the clouds. But that doesn't make any sense, because the waters above are above the dome of heaven where we see the sun, moon, and stars. Okay? I believe the ancient people would have been able to look up and see that the clouds are closer to us than the sun, moon, and stars are. You don't see clouds go behind the sun, moon, and stars. Right? They obscure them very often, is what they do. So, pretty sure the waters above here is not a reference to the clouds. It's not. Okay? Pretty confident about that. If that's the case, then, what are these waters above? Well, notice that nowhere in Genesis chapter 1 is there any reference to outer space. Well, I suppose it's possible there's some translation of the Bible that talks about outer space, but there shouldn't be, because ancient people didn't know about it. They hadn't discovered it yet. I know what you're thinking. You can look up at the sky, you can look at the sun, moon, and stars. What are they floating in? Outer space. So in other words, we can see outer space, right? But are we going to interpret it that way? No. In antiquity, what we understand to be outer space, they understood to be primordial waters. Okay, that's the Primeval Sea. Okay? That being said, what's this dome of heaven? Okay, you look up at the sky, what do you see? Well, one of the things you see when you look up is the Earth's atmosphere. Okay? It looks like it has a kind of dome shape to it. It's because it's a sphere of gases surrounding the Earth. Right? So, what they're calling the dome of heaven, what that actually is the Earth's atmosphere. Or in other words, where the author is placing the sun, moon, and stars is in the Earth's atmosphere. Why am I pointing this out? As I mentioned in my second video on the Primeval Sea, the Bible is not actually the divinely inspired and inerrant Word of God. You're not actually in a situation where if you don't believe something in the Bible, you're going to burn in hell for all eternity. I'm not trying to offend anyone who's raised on this doctrine. Okay, I don't want to make anyone feel stupid for believing that. The point here is it's okay for you to doubt the validity of claims that you hear in the Bible. You're not going to burn in hell for all eternity just because you doubt something in the Bible. If someone told you that, they're wrong. Okay? They're wrong. Face it, sometimes you hear information that's just not good information. And this concept that the Bible is the divinely inspired and inerrant Word of God, everything it is 100% true, that's a great example of misinformation. Okay? Alright. Moving on to day 5. On day 5, we see the creation of the first animals. God gives the waters the ability to produce these animals. So we see the creation of animals that swim in the sea, like fish and whales, and animals of flight, like birds. Okay? So theoretically here, it's the waters below, which are producing the animals of the sea, and the waters above, producing the animals of flight. Right? Theoretically. God is going to be held ultimately responsible. You know, he's bestowing the ability upon the waters to create these things, but at the same time, it's also going to credit God, saying that he did it. Okay? And I don't think we should see that as a contradiction necessarily. It's just, since God is saying, let it be, you know, kind of conducting this stuff, you know, spoken command, he's ultimately responsible for this creation. Moving on to day 6, we have the creation of land animals. These are produced by the earth. So now God has bestowed upon the earth not only the ability to produce vegetation, but also the ability to produce animals of the land. All right, now, again, I have to bring up this concept of the biblical inerrancy, right? If you believe that the Bible's the divinely inspired, inerrant Word of God, everything it is 100% true, if you actually believe that, then that means that you have to reject this idea that birds evolved from land-dwelling animals. Because according to Genesis chapter 1, the birds came first. They're created on day 5. We don't see any animals of the land until day 6. Likewise, if you accept this idea that the birds evolved from land-dwelling reptiles, then you gotta reject what's in the Bible. You gotta reject this idea that birds are created before the land-dwelling reptiles. Because the point here is that they can't both be true. This, you know, evolution of reptiles to birds and what we're seeing in the Bible. One can be true, but not the other. All right? I have to point this out because some people say, well, these two perspectives actually jive with one another. You can believe both what's in Genesis chapter 1 and you can believe Big Bang cosmology and the evolution of species, right? They work together. No, they don't. I understand why some people want to bridge that divide, right? I understand this desire to bring sciencey people to God and to bring religious people to science. I get that. But fact of the matter is, it's just not true that these two different ideas work together. They really don't. Another interesting thing we see on day 6 is the creation of man. Creation of woman, too, right? And so, when God creates man, right, he gives him rule over the earth, right? He gives him dominion over all the animals of the land, animals of the sea, animals that fly, right? He tells him to maintain or to replenish and to subdue the earth. Okay? Kind of puts man in charge. And this is interesting for when we move into chapter 2. In chapter 2, we get to see the 7th day, and God rests on the 7th day. He stops creating. He rests from his creation. So, he creates heaven and earth, all this stuff. He creates man, leaves man in charge, and then goes to bed, right? More or less. And I think that's a cool message, actually. It's kind of like saying, man, the reason you're here is to maintain the earth, right? You're in charge. You don't turn to God and ask him to help everything, to take care of the earth. That's up to you. It's up to you to take care of Mother Earth, right? I thought that was a cool message. But more important for me to bring up here, what is it that God says when he makes man? He says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." This part has really troubled a lot of people, leaves them sort of scratching their heads, wondering, who's us? What other being is here that is like God? What other being here, apart from God, is in the image that we have been made in? There's no previous mention of them in Genesis. Or is there? Frankly, I think it's been talking about them the entire time. These other beings whose image we have been made in are the beings associated with the various aspects of nature that God has been naming. Okay? This is that distinction I'm talking about. This is what separates these named things from the technologies. Okay, those tools, those lights, they're there for signs and seasons and days and years. Those are different kinds of lights than the light of day. All right? Light of day is special. So, these named things, those are gods, basically, right? It's in their image that we have been made. I know what some of you are thinking is, well, wait a minute. We're not made in the image of heaven and earth and the sea and light and darkness. Those aren't humanoid forms. Well, technically you're right, they're not. However, you got to keep in mind the context. These are ancient people we're talking about here. In antiquity, there's this common conception that the various aspects of nature... I'm losing my voice. The various aspects of nature are peopled by sentient beings. Now, this is the case whether you look at Norse mythology, Greco-Roman mythology, ancient Egypt, Syria, Palestine, ancient Turkey, Iraq, Iran, India. All these major myth-producing cultures tended to depict their most important gods in some kind of humanoid form. These gods are associated with the various aspects of nature. And so, this concept that man is made in the image of God is actually rooted in the concept that man is made in the image of the gods. This goes all the way back to the Sumerians. Remember, the Sumerians are responsible for the earliest written language known to us. So, it's not surprising then the way that this creation account ends. And where I perceive this creation account to end is halfway through the 4th verse of the 2nd chapter. Right? Keep in mind the chapter and verse divisions that modern versions of the Bible now take were not present in the original Hebrew manuscripts. They're added later. Okay? So it looks to me like you kind of have one story and then another story is just kind of placed right next to it. Right? So, we have the creation, heaven and earth, we have man, God leaves man in charge and then rests, and then it tells us, very last verse of the creation account, right? Verse 4, Genesis chapter 2, it says, "These are the generations of heaven and earth when they were created." These are the generations of heaven and earth. I really don't think that Genesis chapter 1 is the monotheistic creation account that people customarily interpret it to be. Okay? There's various aspects of nature that God's been naming. Those are gods. Right? They're the children of Elohim. That's what I mean when I say they're gods. They're the children of God himself. Alright? Just as the Canaanite god El was father of the gods, Elohim is father of the gods. Elohim's basically just a promoted version of El. Right? He's a new version of El. Well, let me know what you guys think about that theory. Comment section down below. Have fun, right? That being said, to be continued, I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Maybe even share it with other people. If you're interested in watching my future videos, please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. In my next video, I'm going to be returning to the subject of Genesis to discuss, well, I guess what I'll be doing is comparing the 1st chapter to the 2nd chapter. So I hope to see you all there. Thank you for watching. Peace, and have a good one.